Today on Conversations Aloud, we are discussing mass atrocities in the 21st century, focusing on the Gaza conflict, the Sudan civil war, and the role of international law in protecting civilians. We're joined by Mike Brand, a human rights, atrocities prevention, and peacebuilding professional who's worked with many NGOs in the US, Rwanda, South Sudan, Congo, and Uganda. Mike also directs the Human Security Project and supports civil society organizations and diaspora networks in their strategic planning, their program development, and achieving their advocacy objectives. He's also an adjunct professor of mass atrocities prevention and human rights at Georgetown University and the University of Connecticut. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So, Mike, so you work in atrocities prevention. Why does it feel that the international community is very good at documenting atrocities, but find it very difficult to prevent them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the main challenges is that for prevention to really work, you need to be invested in the idea of prevention, right? You need to actually have the tools and use them. There's a lot of time in our field, we talk about the tools in the toolkit. But more often than not, the response when there is, an impending mass atrocity situation, it's let's just throw some sanctions at the problem and hope that it gets better. And there isn't really enough of the long-term kind of upstream planning to actually ensure that atrocities don't happen. And so by the time they do happen, there is only, the response of documenting the crimes, maybe calling out the bad actors, maybe, calling for some kind of international jurisdiction for the International Criminal Court or some other kind of, atrocity accountability, and maybe trying to punish the perpetrators in real time. But it usually, the actual act of punishing the perpetrators takes a lot longer than that. And so the challenge and some of the work that I'm trying to do right now is look at what would it take for us to actually move towards a more prevention-focused foreign policy? How do we get to, in the U.S. government especially, change the approach that we have towards these crises and get a little bit more upstream of violent conflict than we normally do?
Okay, so it's more of they're taking a bit of a lazy approach with, hey, let's just slap some sanctions and then we'll let the ICC, once they kind of figure out what's happening, which may take a year, 2 years, sometimes more.
Sometimes longer. I mean, in Darfur, it took 20 years. So
that's crazy. So, I mean, if the U.S. government or any government is supposed to take more active action, what does that look like? What do they need to do?
Yeah. No, great question. So I think there's two separate levels, right? There's the long-term approach to prevention, which really looks like ensuring that a country has the ability to, have a stable government. There's ways for people to express their grievances with the government and not necessarily with each other. Ways in which there's conflict resolution, there's less, economic hardship, all these kinds of things that can be drivers of violent conflict, right? So this is like a longer-term project here. Then there's the short term. We have a warning of this. We see that there's, turmoil. We see that there's maybe some ethnic strife. There's maybe a lot of stuff popping up on social media. And there's these kind of, warning signs, but just before violence has broken out. And so there's opportunities to get involved at different stages of, the conflict curve. And so those long-term upstream, work is really reducing fragility, trying to find ways in which to help, prop up the court system, helping ways to prop up, and ensure that there's a representative democracy as best as there can be, ensuring that civil society is able to express their voice and isn't being cracked down upon, at every given turn. But then when you get closer to, the emergence of violent conflict, it's really trying to find a way to work with the governments as an actor, as well as non-state actors, depending on who the perpetrator of that, atrocity could be, and finding ways to provide them with the tools that they need to make sure that they're not actually turning to violence, ensuring that there is clear and, very discrete, accountability measures. So if this happens, this is what our response is going to be. And the our needs to be more than just the UK government or the US government or the French government. It needs to be a wider range, right? So you mentioned Sudan at the start. The US has sanctioned several actors in Sudan for years. The UK government has as well. those sanctions don't really have much of an impact when they're able to take most of their money and put it in the UAE. So it's great that we have sanctions on these certain actors, but if they're able to get their money in other places, it's really just, window dressing. It doesn't actually make much of a difference in real time. And then ensuring that there's actually a mechanism and a way for protection of civilians and for some kind of, I don't want to say use of force in the sense of like a full-on scale war, but ensuring that, we can deploy peacekeepers or we can deploy some kind of mechanism to monitor. Right now, that has just been way too slow. The last time that we had a major peacekeeping operation was 2014. And so, it's not really a tool that we're using in the toolbox as often as we used to.
Is that in Sudan?
No, the Sudan, just internationally, the last time that we had a major peacekeeping operation. Yeah.
So it's interesting. You're saying basically that we need to work with those governments to create stability and strengthen their institutions. Do you see kind of, I guess, the U.S. government's work becoming difficult in that aspect when, at the same time, some parts of the government create
100%.
instability, and
100%.
We see that in the Middle East, like the wars in Iraq and kind of supporting certain factions in Syria, which have created a civil war. So it's kind of like there's two competing forces that are making this difficult.
I agree. I mean, and I speak about the hypocrisy of our foreign policy all the time. And, I've talked to people within the U.S. government over the years that, they've said that, behind closed doors, obviously, but they've said that it's made their job harder, right? So like they recognize the challenge that is posed. It is, a big challenge. And it's not even in the case, like you just mentioned, Iraq, Afghanistan, those are like the big ones. Iran, obviously the support for the genocide in Gaza. But even on a smaller scale, what you'll see sometimes is the U.S. government will be funding and supporting pro-democracy initiatives, civil society, all these kinds of things, election monitoring, et cetera, while helping to prop up a semi-dictatorship by providing security sector reform and training and arms, because either we need them for the fight against terrorism, or we're helping to use some of those soldiers and send them to another place for a peacekeeping mission. And so what ends up happening is, you're having a small bit of money funding some kind of a democracy program and a lot more money funding security sector reform, which is really just, training and arming the soldiers that maybe aren't there to protect the civilians, but protect, the quasi dictatorship. And so there's a real tension. And I think, I mentioned the U.S. because that's where I'm based, but I don't think the U.S. is the only actor, or should it be. The challenge has been, historically, it's been the largest actor, right? And so much of the money that was going out the door in a lot of these places was coming from the U.S. government. And, they used to say that, like, the U.S. government is, the elephant in the room, kind of whichever way it turns, it's going to have an impact. And so trying to manage and, move the direction of the U.S. government in the right way is like the best thing that we can do. Right now, with pulling out of, the dissolution of USAID and cutting off a lot of, funding and support through the State Department, there's some holes that are being filled by other governments and other foundations, but still nowhere near the level that the U.S. government is funding some of these programs.
Yeah. So in your view, what is the agency or organization that should take a lead on preventing atrocities from happening? Is it the UN with support from the ICC to kind of punish while the UN kind of prevents?
Yeah. I'd say in theory, right, we would love for the UN to be the entity that is able to manage conflict and is able to help prevent mass atrocities from happening. The UN was never established to do that, though, right? Like, if you look at the UN Charter, the reason for creating the United Nations was to prevent international warfare and to not have a return to World War II. So a lot of the words in the Charter focus on international war. A lot of mass atrocities that we see today are intrastate wars. So they're wars that are happening either, like a civil war, like you mentioned in Syria, which, within the boundaries of the state, or it's a government on, a certain group of people within the country. And so maybe not a full-on war, but an asymmetric war. The UN is not very well equipped to deal with that still. Part of the challenge is with the UN Security Council, we need veto reform. We can't have a situation where the U.S. government is able to veto every single resolution on Israel, and Russia or China or vetoing things on Syria or Myanmar. Like, it's just not a useful use of anybody's time. So finding ways to get around that and finding ways to be a little bit quicker is part of the problem. And the UN is not equipped to be able to react at the speed that we need them to sometimes. As far as the ICC goes, similarly, I think many people are distraught with how long it takes for the International Criminal Court to actually get to a case, and whether that's opening the case or actually holding somebody accountable. The court is supposed to be the court of last resort, so I don't think we should be prioritizing the International Criminal Court as like the first mechanism. But it's there, and it's able to take on cases when local justice or regional justice mechanisms can't. But I hope one of the things that has been a stumbling block in some ways for action has been this debate over, like, is this a genocide? Is it not genocide? Is it this? Is it that? And there's a Crimes Against Humanity Convention that's working its way through the UN process right now. And I'm hopeful that if that convention actually comes to pass and enough countries get on board, it may open up more opportunities for universal jurisdiction under the Crimes Against Humanity framework, but also cut out some of this debate, and that leads to an action of like, well, are we calling this genocide? Are we not? If we could just agree crimes against humanity are occurring and we need somebody to step in and do something, hopefully there's a little bit of a quicker action.
I guess also the ICC's ability to do anything has been curtailed, I think, especially during this whole Gaza conflict, because
100%.
the US have sanctioned some of these judges, the European judges, and Europe hasn't said much about this because it's America that's sanctioning, which is insane.
Right. It's totally insane. And the sanctions mechanisms that the Trump administration has used are the exact same mechanisms that you would use to hold a war criminal or a genocidaire accountable, or an international criminal, like a drug smuggler or something. Those are the kind of sanctions mechanisms that we were applying on not only the International Criminal Court, but also Francesca Albanese, who is the special rapporteur working on the occupied Palestinian territories from the UN. It's crazy. And the way that the sanctions were listed, they didn't end up sanctioning all of these people, but the way that the sanctions were worded, if you go back to the initial statement, it's basically anybody that is working with the ICC on the Israel case. And so, basically anybody down to like the person that was making photocopies for the International Criminal Court on the case could have potentially been sanctioned. And just so everybody knows, I think we throw this term around, sanctions, a lot. The way that the sanctions work, especially from the US, that can be powerful on certain actors, is it could block you from getting access to your bank accounts, depending on which kind of authorities your bank uses. It could block you from getting, any travel to the United States, which for some people is not a big deal, but for other people that is. Maybe you have kids that go to school here, maybe you were planning on taking a trip here for work or whatever. And it could also prevent certain companies from working with you just because of the fear of, we see that their name is on a sanctions list, like we don't want to have anything to do with them. So it can have a really massive impact on your life, especially if you're not an actual international criminal that has a lot of their money in, the black market or in gold or other ways that you can get access to funds. If you're, a normal citizen that just has your money in the bank account, all of a sudden your assets are frozen. Like, that's a big impact.
Yeah, that is crazy. But just kind of taking a step back, you said that the UN is not the right kind of organization. So do we need a new organization set up, or is there one that exists that can, do this properly?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in my mind, part of the challenge is that when you look at many of the areas in which mass atrocities do occur, they occur in neighborhoods, for lack of a better word, that also have their own issues. And I think it's a systemic, long-term approach that we need. If you look at the situation in Sudan, for instance, it's not like any of its neighbors are fully stable, well-functioning democracies. If they were, I would say maybe the response, instead of having a new entity or anything like that, it could be regional responses, right? It's not good for your neighbor to be experiencing mass atrocities. It messes with trade. It's insecurity at your borders. You're going to have refugee flows. So it would behoove the local governments in the region to be doing more to prevent the atrocities from happening, to broker a peace agreement, to figure out a way forward on a transition to civilian rule. But when you have Egypt, South Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, all experiencing their own challenges, some of which are experiencing their own civil wars or mass atrocity situations, it's very difficult to rely on them to be, reliable interveners and interlocutors and actors in that, regard, especially when you're, certain countries have a direct stake in the war. So I would say, it would be great if we can get to, and this is obviously a long-term vision, but any kind of reform, is a place where the regional governments, the regional actors, many regions have, whether it's ASEAN in Asia, whether it's the African Union or the East African Community or, IGAD or ECOWAS, there's these regional mechanisms that exist, some of which actually have rapid reaction forces, in theory for a peacekeeping operation, can have, regional governments come together for meetings and things. It's on, them to some degree to help, I don't want to say police, but like support their neighbors in getting through those kinds of episodes.
So going a bit more regional than kind of global approach would be more effective.
I think so.
So I guess before we go to Sudan, touch on Gaza. I mean, why do you believe the world is so powerless in stopping the atrocities being committed in Gaza when it's so obvious? We can see it every day. And it's one of those things that it's live streamed to us.
For sure.
What do you think is the issue there?
Yeah, I think, Gaza in our generation may be the thing that we look back on and, is a major turning point in a lot of ways. There's in the field of, the wider field of atrocities and mass atrocity prevention, there's been, multiple episodes throughout time. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda and, the genocide in Srebrenica were like big moments that led to the creation of the responsibility to protect framework, which, every government in 2005 got on board with, that we should, protect civilian populations from mass atrocities. After the Holocaust in World War II, in 1948, the Genocide Convention was created and adopted in response to that. I think in many ways, the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, if it does go forward, is going to be, passed partially in response to the horrors that we're seeing, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and in Lebanon.
Sorry, just before you continue, that can it be vetoed? That
the Crimes Against Humanity Convention? Yeah. No, so it'll go through a process. It's a multi-layered process of different committees and everything else. But once it comes forward, it goes to the General Assembly.
Okay.
Yeah. There's certain parts of that can be vetoed, like along the way. There could be like people that vote, against certain elements of it, and that's part of the negotiation that's happening right now. And it can get watered down, but the entire thing, it doesn't have the ability to be vetoed. But going back to Gaza specifically, I think there's a real challenge when, for years, the Muslim populations around the world, especially in Western countries, have been demonized and have been castigated as like second or third class. And when you see the death of young children in Gaza, that should shock everybody's conscience. And for some reason, for some people, because they're Muslim, it just doesn't affect them the same way. And when it comes to Israel, especially, there are some people, many people, including the current president or the former president, President Biden, that have such a connection. They're such vehement Zionists in many ways that there's almost nothing that Israel could do that would make them lose their support. And that's part of, several different elements, and a lot of people will blame AIPAC and, the funding and the lobbying machine. But there's also, just for some people, it's a very Christian component. The Christian nationalists in this country have a very strong connection to Israel for revelations and, the end of days and all these things. But Joe Biden used to say regularly, like, if there were no Israel, America would have to create an Israel, right? Like, if there were no Israel, there were no place for Jews around the world to be safe, which personally, as a Jew, I find that extremely offensive that the president of the United States believes he couldn't protect Jews here in his own country. But
Yeah.
I
And then
digress.
just like
Um,
Mike Huckabee just, I think this week said, if it wasn't
oh
for
my God,
Israel,
yes.
United States wouldn't exist.
Right. Yeah. Going back to this Judeo-Christian, founding idea. And it's also, I watched something like that. I'm like, whose ambassador are you? Are you an ambassador from the United States, or are you an ambassador from Israel to the United States? It's a little strange. And he's obviously kind of going back against what Trump was saying. Trump, of course, propping himself up, saying that Israel wouldn't exist without him. But so I think there's several different challenges. I think over the years, for many years, there's been a narrative that was created that, Israel's founding had nothing to do with the Nakba. There was like two different, narratives. And Israel is always the one that is being beat up upon, and Israel is always under threat. And there's always, an attempt to, the Holocaust again and try to wipe out all the Jews. And October 7th really opened up a lot of those wounds for a lot of people. October 7th was obviously a horrific terrorist attack. And, I personally never endorse any kind of violence against civilians. But when it comes to genocide and mass atrocity crimes, of which you could argue for sure that, Hamas committed crimes against humanity and potentially war crimes on the 7th, there's never an excuse for another government or another actor to commit mass atrocity crimes in response to or due to the threat of another mass atrocity crime. And in many cases, whether that's Sudan, whether that's Rwanda, whether that's Myanmar, even, with the situation in the Uyghurs in China, the perpetrator often uses the threat of mass atrocities as a reason to justify their own mass atrocities. And you could see when, it comes with, Israel, the level of atrocity crimes is much larger than in many other places where we were very quick to condemn, including Russia's war in Ukraine. I mean, very early on, President Biden and others were calling Putin a war criminal for bombing civilian infrastructure. And yet, when Israel was bombing civilian infrastructure in Gaza, nothing was said. When they were blocking, aid convoys, which is a clear violation of international law, nothing was said. When children were being shot in the head, nothing was said. And so it's very disheartening. It's very concerning. As somebody who teaches this stuff, it's very difficult to have a lot of hope, for the students in the future when we're watching how bad this is playing out. And continues to play out.
Yeah, but I feel like there is a change now. Talking about hope, the public are seeing things that they've never seen before because of alternative media, social media, but also, some Israeli politicians are so brazen, and it's shocking how comfortable they are. Like, what's his name? Ben
Gvir or Smotrich, the two of them.
Ben Gvir just today was talking about how for every soldier killed, we need to make 1,000 mothers cry in Lebanon. And it's just like they're just,
and destroying their homes. I mean, very clearly say like we need to destroy whole neighborhoods.
So it's kind of like they're saying it, we're seeing it, the public is seeing it, and there is a shift now in public perception. And especially the whole kind of connection between, I think, the Christians that see this as a duty to support Israel no matter what, that has been showcased, I think, for a lot of people as a very shocking, because there's a religious element to
for sure
it. So there is a shift, I think. How do you see that shift actually contributing to future atrocities, preventing atrocities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things, right? Like one thing is we try to elect leaders that have the same values that we want to see play out, right? And at least in the United States, one of the challenges is that it doesn't matter as much who is in Congress. It matters who's sitting, in the White House, who's the president, because the president controls foreign policy, to an nth degree compared to Congress. I hope that in the next, round of elections, this is an issue that's front and center. Americans often don't vote based on foreign policy, but we're seeing right now with, the upcoming midterm elections and a lot of pushback, a lot of people are much more tuned into not only what's going on in Gaza, but what the U.S. government has been doing in Iran. I'm hoping that it's a moment of reckoning, and it's a moment of awareness, and it's a moment of, where people are just paying attention. And we need to elect better leaders, leaders that actually care about other humans. And that's what, for me, is so disheartening, somebody like President Biden, because he, as a senator, had a long history of speaking out against mass atrocities, whether that was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, whether that was in Sudan, and other places, often encouraging the U.S. government to do more. When he was president in 2021, he went to the University of Connecticut and gave a big speech on human rights. And I have, part of the quote here. He basically said, whenever we hear that kind of poisonous hatred, whenever we see our fellow humans being dehumanized, it doesn't mean we go to war, but we must speak out. Silence is complicity. And yet, he was watching what was happening in Gaza and not only being silent, but protecting the Israeli regime, sending more arms, doing damage control, protecting them at the UN. And so it was worse than complicity. It was direct involvement. And I think, we are having this reckoning to some degree, but even in the media, like you said, people are getting this information from alternative sources, from local reporters, from social media content creators. But even our general media is still terrible, including in the UK. I mean, some of these articles that you see the titles of with the BBC is like, children have died in Gaza. Like, how did they die? Or Israel says that they're going to stay in Lebanon for security. No, they're occupying. They're illegally occupying and destroying homes. It's a form of ethnic cleansing. And these are just not the words that we're using to describe these phenomena.
Yeah, for sure. What's interesting also is Trump this week has changed his position on Israel. It seems he's actually calling out, what Israel's actions. He literally said, you don't have to blow up a building just to get one guy.
Yep.
And so it's very interesting seeing the shift happening with the Trump administration. Congress is still very as they were before on the Israel position. Trump seems to be changing his position, which is more aligned with the public in the U.S. That would be probably better for him in the midterm elections to stand to Israel when it comes to aligning to the public, not in terms of funding.
No.
But there is a shift even at the top level.
Yeah, and I'd say, I posted that video as well. I would say I would be cautiously optimistic. He has said similar things, about the way that Israel is perpetrating the Gaza war as well, but also then continued to try to get more money and more arms to Israel. And so I think he might say things like that here and there, but he's still going to support Israel at the end of the day. And obviously was dragged into this war in many ways based on Netanyahu's, pressing, into the war in Iran. I don't think this war is anywhere near over yet. This MOU is kind of ridiculous. The Israelis have also already said that this MOU and the situation with Iran has nothing to do with what we're doing in Lebanon, which you could also assume has nothing to do with what they're doing in the West Bank and in Gaza. But yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. has incredible authority and incredible power to wield over the situation if we chose to use it. If you just threatened to cut off arms early on in the Gaza war, that would have changed the calculus. If you would have just threatened to, cut off support and defense at the United Nations Security Council, that would have changed the calculus. But we refuse to do that. And, as long as we keep giving, endless support to the state of Israel, especially with this government, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. And you're right to say, we might be a bit too optimistic, but there was a hint from JD Vance saying basically the U.S. provides 2/3 of your defense to Israel, because he's saying, why are they complaining? And it's paid by U.S. taxpayers at the end of the day. And
it's interesting. I'll just say the conservative side, this is where there's that horseshoe of, politics. I've seen more conservatives than anybody mad about the fact that, we're sending this money to Israel and they have free healthcare and they have, access to education. They have all these things. And so, but yet we don't. And so it's like, how do we balance that out?
Yeah. Interesting. I want to shift to Sudan, because most people are not aware of what's happening. Can you just explain the situation right now in Sudan?
Yeah, so to take a very long story and make it as short as possible, in 2018, 2019, you had popular uprisings from civilians, mainly in Khartoum, but then across the country, protesting against a whole host of things, a 30-year dictatorship, rising cost of goods, etc. And as those protests got to a head, these two men, Burhan and Hemeti, one who was running the army and another who was running basically a quasi militia known as the Rapid Support Forces, joined together and toppled the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. Over the next few years, from 2019 to 2023, there was attempts to get to a civilian transition, power struggles between these two individuals and the constituencies that they represented, and an attempt to put in basically a partnership between the military and a civilian leadership. There was, several coups along the way and arresting of, certain individuals. Everything kind of came to a head in April of 2023 when the two sides, the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is basically the army and the de facto government now, and the Rapid Support Forces, which is this kind of like paramilitary that's very well armed and very well equipped, went to war. And the war started in Khartoum, in the capital city, which was very different from many of the other wars that people may be familiar with in Sudan, and many of the mass atrocities in Darfur or in the Nuba Mountains or in the North-South War, all kind of happened in the periphery outside of the capital city. Since then, the war has taken shifts and turns, and the Rapid Support Forces were moved out of Khartoum. They retreated to some degree back to Darfur, which was their stronghold, and committed horrible mass atrocities in El Fasher and in other places across Darfur, in the south area, as well as what's happening right now. But there's ongoing violence still between the two sides. There's ongoing violence and targeting of civilians. And there's a lot of support from international actors like the United Arab Emirates, the Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Russia, etc. And that's where we are. We're in a kind of endless sort of stalemate of the war. Neither side has the ability to kind of fully win out the war right now. And neither side has an interest in getting to peace, which we could talk about, some of the attempts to get there and broker some deals, but it hasn't really gotten very far.
Okay. And are there atrocities happening right now there?
Yes. So they're happening on a few different fronts. There's targeting of civilians that, the government forces, the Sudanese armed forces, had been targeting seemingly like opposition forces to some degree. So some people were being targeted directly. There's the use of drones that is pretty widespread right now, and using the drones to attack civilian targets or byproducts of some of the violence. And just yesterday, actually, there was a statement by 29 different governments that was warning of mass atrocities in El Obeid, which is in kind of central Sudan. The RSF is kind of moving across the country, kind of trying to march their way back towards Khartoum. And in doing so, the statement warns of 500,000 people that could be at risk of mass atrocities. So the risk is very real. The atrocities are still happening. People are still under threat. There's a lot of conflict-related sexual violence, targeting women and girls. And on top of that, just people that are suffering byproducts of the war, with displacement, with starvation, and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate that we don't hear much about it. Why do you feel some atrocities are more front and center and others take a backseat?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think depending on what else is in the media is a big thing for sure. I think depending on the color of the people that are being affected is a big thing. The fact that in Sudan it is a majority Muslim population that is fighting against each other, that there is a dynamic where there is to some degree an Arab versus African level, but it's in especially Western media, if it was Muslim Christian, you probably would see a lot more about Sudan. But an African state in the sort of MENA, Middle East, North Africa region, that really a lot of people couldn't find on a map. They don't really understand why, this is important, versus something like Ukraine in the early days. There was wall-to-wall media coverage of Ukraine. And unfortunately, part of the challenge is as these crises go longer, there's less and less attention paid. Right now in the U.S., we don't even hear much about what's going on in Ukraine. So even though Ukraine got a lot more attention early days, now it hasn't. And so same thing with Sudan, where now in the fourth year of war, people have kind of tuned out, and it's really unfortunate. I'd say also when you think of something like Gaza is like smack dab in the middle of the Middle East, and so you have a lot of folks that watch the Middle East region. You have a lot of folks that are have a kinship as other Muslims in the community that are speaking about what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank and in Lebanon. Sudan is in this weird region. They're in the continent of Africa, but it's an somewhat Arab state, and it's Muslim, but it's it sits in a place in Africa. So there's like African media that isn't fully covering it. The Middle East media isn't fully covering it. And so it's kind of in a gap. And there's just not a lot of people that have a focus on Sudan.
Yeah. And I guess to your point, the media is all about kind of the next thing that, that it's about attention. And even Gaza is now taking a step back, to be honest, because of the Iran war.
Exactly. Yeah. And which is a challenge because so many of these things overlap, right? Like in Sudan, the war would not have been able to go this long if certain actors were not funneling arms and money and support and protection into the war in Sudan. The RSF and the SAF would have run out of weapons had Iran and the UAE especially not been continuing to funnel arms and support in there. But this connects back to the war in Iran, right? And so there's a challenge as well. I do a lot of advocacy here in Washington, D.C., and I would have meetings with, folks on the Hill, in Congress, and they would ask questions. And when we were trying to push, a Sudan agenda and like, hey, we need to be doing more. Well, like, is this the right time to put pressure on the UAE? Because, they're getting bombed by Iran right now. Well, yeah, I mean, it has nothing to do with each other, right? Like they're still arming and fueling a war in Sudan. Yes, it's terrible that they're, receiving, the brunt of Iran's forces, but it doesn't change the fact that they're also helping to be complicit in genocide and mass atrocities in Sudan.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, we've been we've lost hope in international law because we've seen so many things happen that we thought international law was there to safeguard and to prevent these things from happening. Do you see still that international law is there that enforces a system to prevent, or is it more kind of acts as a hopeful wish list of kind of a moral framework than more of a legal framework?
Yeah. I think right now we're in a moment where several of the biggest, most powerful states have, thumbed their nose, in the face of international law. The United States government, has been obviously complicit in what was going on in Gaza and, to a much wider extent, directly committing mass atrocities when it comes to these strikes in the Caribbean, when it comes to the war in Iran, when it comes to, I'm sure before Trump's term is over, he'll bomb another place. He seems to just like bombing places.
Cuba, yeah.
Cuba, right. Russia in Ukraine, obviously another big power. And then, unfortunately, France and the UK, the others in the Security Council, also complicit in supporting Israel or protecting Israel in some way, shape or form. And so then you have, China with the Uyghurs. So like all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council over the last few years have been either directly complicit or directly perpetrating mass atrocity crimes, violating international humanitarian and human rights law. I think for years there's been, and it's not just now, this has been happening for years before, in the United States, it's a Democrat and a Republican problem. Democrats had also committed, violations of international law. I think in theory, we wanted international law to be, a prevention mechanism, right? That this is there and, we are paying attention and people will be held accountable for these crimes. It only works if they're actually held accountable. And I think, a major mistake in the United States was after all of the, information from the war on terror came out of torture and extraordinary rendition and all these things, more people should have been held accountable. During the Obama years, committing mass acts of drone strikes, blowing up civilian targets left and right, labeling any, Muslim age male above 18 as an enemy combatant, even if we didn't know who they were. these are all violations of international law, and yet they kept happening and nobody was held accountable. So the accountability, I think, is a really important piece of it. It's not, you can't just have these words on paper and leave them there and hope that they're going to do something. There needs to be accountability.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be, like the United States right now is hosting the World Cup. Why are we hosting the World Cup while we're involved in, several different military actions, locking up people on the streets left and right here in the United States, but also launched an illegal war in Iran, and kidnapped, the president of Venezuela and are bombing people in the Caribbean. Like, it is insane to me. I couldn't imagine Russia being allowed to host the World Cup after they invaded Ukraine, yet somehow the United States is absolved of that when it comes to, the war in Iran. So we need international law for it to work. It needs to be applied equally across the board. Yeah. And it's hard to do when you have some of the richest, most powerful nations being the ones that are committing the violations. Yet that doesn't stop us from arguing, oh yeah, you should, be held accountable for these crimes. I mean, when it comes to, you mentioned the International Criminal Court, as the court that would actually enforce some of these laws. When Russia was indicted, when Putin were indicted, the U.S. government celebrated that indictment by the International Criminal Court. When Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu were, indicted, we sanctioned the International Criminal Court. Like that just can't be. You can't have it both ways, right? And the good thing about something like the International Criminal Court or, an international tribunal, it should be a court, right? So you could be held accountable, but you could also defend yourself there, right? It's not the arrest warrant doesn't mean you are immediately held guilty, so you should be able to go and defend yourself. But for us to then turn around and sanction the court and be like, no, you're going, outside of your mandate. No, that is the mandate.
Yeah. Do you see that, or do you think we'll ever get to a time where, Benjamin Netanyahu will be indicted for what they did in Gaza?
I mean, he's indicted by the ICC right now, right? There's an arrest warrant for war crimes only. I think they're also looking into potential crimes against humanity as well. It's a lot. Genocide is a much higher bar, in the international court system. The International Court of Justice, the South Africa case, is trying to hold the state of Israel accountable for genocide. But again, that's, we're now 3 years into this, horrific atrocity, and the ICJ still hasn't come down with a verdict. Like, why does it take so long? You have so much of the evidence. As you mentioned before, the words out of, the leaders of Israel's mouth is the exact kind of evidence you would use and has been used in other, criminal cases, whether that was the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda or at the ICC, to hold people accountable for these kinds of crimes.
My understanding is the difficulty is showing that the action that they took was specifically to destroy in part or in whole, the population. Because if you have a military objective, and how do you prove you have a military objective? No one can prove it, because, hey, we have intelligence that says there was one person in there, so we had to blow up the whole building, so I think that's my understanding is the difficulty of proving that.
Yeah, so the definition of genocide based on the 1948 Convention is the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. And so that intent to destroy in whole or in part is the biggest wishy-washy piece of that definition, right? So you have to prove intent, which is difficult to do. In the case of, Israel and Gaza, though, it's not just killing members of the group. It's also creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part. And I would say in many ways, that's almost a better argument of proving genocide, because when you are destroying all of the civilian infrastructure, when you're targeting and destroying the water treatment plants and the electricity, when you're targeting and destroying hospitals and schools and refugee camps and IDP camps, like all these places, you're making it impossible for certain people to survive. Blocking of aid, all these things. The challenge with the way that international law works is at the International Court of Justice, they only have jurisdiction over conventions that are established within the UN system, right? So even though crimes against humanity exists as a crime that you could be held accountable under the Rome Statute at the International Criminal Court, individuals can be held accountable for that. Since there is no crimes against humanity convention yet, which, as I mentioned before, hopefully soon we'll have one, the ICJ doesn't have any jurisdiction over crimes against humanity. I think if South Africa, if we wound back the clock and we had a crimes against humanity convention, and South Africa had a case before the International Criminal Court of Justice for crimes against humanity, it would be a slam dunk. There's no way that you could argue that what Israel has been doing is not crimes against humanity. To your point, it gets harder to prove intent. Although when you have leaders in Israel basically saying, we want to destroy this population, we need to move them out.
What more do they need to say?
Exactly. I mean, those are the kinds of things that prosecutors would look for and spend, weeks and months trying to comb through and find documentation. Meanwhile, they're saying it on public TV.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. You said there, we don't have yet a way to indict people for war crimes.
No. So under the Rome Statute, which is what established the International Criminal Court, they have jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression, which is kind of a separate issue. But it's only the ICC only has jurisdiction over certain states, states that are a party to the Rome Statute, states that the Security Council asks the ICC to investigate, or if a state asks, it to be investigated itself. So there's certain situations where the ICC just does not have any jurisdiction, regardless of the crimes that are being perpetrated. Yeah. The International Court of Justice, which is not a criminal court, it's more like a civil, court. It's between governments. They only have jurisdiction over basically disputes between states. And so the South Africa case is basically charging the state of Israel with violating the Genocide Convention, of which it is a state party. But because there is no Crimes Against Humanity Convention, they can't say that they're violating crimes against humanity, even though it is a well-established piece of customary international law, and international tribunals have charged people with crimes against humanity, including the Nuremberg trials. Because there's not a standalone convention, they don't have that jurisdiction. But in the future, they could. But to your point of, will Netanyahu ever face, judgment? I think the higher likelihood is that he gets to a place where he's such a pariah in the international system that he's only able to ever leave Israel or travel to certain very friendly nations. Because already you're seeing when he flies certain places, he's going around, countries he doesn't want to be stopped. I could see a world in which, if he did get to a certain European nation or whatever, especially after he's no longer, the prime minister, somebody would be willing to arrest him and charge him under the principle of your universal jurisdiction. So he might not go to the International Criminal Court, but I could see him being charged with something, hopefully. But much more likely that he just lives out his dying days in Israel.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, just lastly, if we talked about the kind of international system, if you could change certain aspects of the international system to improve our ability to protect civilians, what would we be able to do there? Is there anything that we need to change, or is it just simply the implementation that's the issue?
I think it's two things, right? It's both. There's things that we definitely can change, and what we have, the frameworks that we have that already exist, if they were just implemented across the board, things would be way better than they are. Right? If the principles of international law were applied equally as they're written right now, things would be much better. If we actually had countries and governments around the world that took to the responsibility to protect and said, no, it is on all of us to ensure that we are preventing civilians from suffering the harms of mass atrocities and did something about it, we would be in a much better place. But I think, one of the challenges is, while outsiders can look at, mass atrocity situations and say, like, how could you let this kind of suffering happen? This is horrible. It's, it's disturbing, people's lives. It's, killing people. It's disturbing markets. It's making it more difficult for people to live. The other side of that is that some people become very wealthy and powerful because of mass atrocities. And I think the incentive structures there are part of the challenge. And in many circumstances, mass atrocities are not happening just because. There's other reasons for that, whether that is access to land, access to resources, money exchanges, for, arming certain individuals in exchange for something else. And so I think that structure also needs to change in some ways. And I'm not saying like we need to burn down the entire capitalist system, but, this idea that mass atrocities are only a net negative. For human rights advocates and others, we would say that, but there are other people on the flip side of that that are becoming very wealthy because of these atrocity crimes. And so we need to find ways to pull at that structure as well, not just the international law component, but ensuring that, it's not just the people that are causing the direct harm, but it's the other people that are profiting from this, that are enabling this, that are also held accountable for those crimes.
For sure. And for people that are watching that want to do something to kind of contribute or help out, what can they do?
Yeah, depends on where you are, frankly, right? I think people that are in certain countries where speaking out against these crimes can provide, direct harm to you as well. You have to, take that up on yourself. If you live in a country where you are able to express your opinions freely, I would say do that as often as you can. Put pressure on your elected leaders. Write things in your local, papers and op-eds, kind of try to shift the narrative. I do a lot of, conversations with people and try to get them to see a different perspective, just actually having straight conversations, especially with people that are traditionally more Zionist when it comes to Gaza and things, and try to get them to understand things. Because as you said, a lot of these things people don't see every day, right? And so you or I may be seeing, horrible things that are happening. I've talked to several of, friends and family that I'm like, yeah, did you see it? No, I didn't even see this. So, meeting people where they are to some degree, and then just really getting more involved. I think, trying to find a way to support the different advocacy and humanitarian organizations that are doing tremendous work, trying to get a little bit more upstream in electing leaders that are actually going to care about these issues, ask these questions, especially in the United States. We have, elections that are coming up in the next year. Ask these questions of these candidates. Don't let them get off the hook. And if they get into power and they're not doing what you want, push them and vote them out. In the UK, you guys are struggling with your own challenges with the whole Palestine action situation. So, I would say get involved there. Free speech, and free assembly is a pretty critical component of this. And yeah, we just need more people to be speaking out in favor of humanity, basically. And I think, especially nowadays with, the economic situation and everything else, people are retreating back into themselves. But we need to be more united than ever.
Yeah, 100%. Mike, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. If people wanted to kind of find out more about your work or reach out, where can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much everywhere. Mike the Idealist. You could put a little link maybe in the description. On YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all the things. And the Human Security Project.
Mike,
Perfect.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.